Well, hello. This is my second attempt at recording this, by the way. Going through a couple more chapters in this. I actually have 4 chapters to do. I'm splitting it into 2 episodes of 2 chapters each. So we are going to do chapters 8 and 9. Let me find where 8 starts, because again, my second time at this. I'll drink to that. Chapter 8 is entitled Harry's Lovely Farewell, and that is in reference to the funeral of Harry Truman, which figures quite prominently in this episode. And I hope you are getting something out of this with the broad overview of this book. I'm like kind of doing my own Cliff Notes version, though I've been chattering my ear off to Wayne about it, because I'm really enjoying learning about this point in history. So Nixon, in January 3rd, 73, had said, the purpose of the bombing, and he's having conversations with Ziegler, who does his press conferences. So he said the purpose of the bombing was to break the deadlock in Paris, but you can't say that. Why were the North Vietnamese coming back to the table? Because we bombed them, but you can't say that. And all Nixon would say about future action if these negotiations didn't go forward was that there would be, all he would say actually is that there would be serious negotiations in Paris, and by implication he opened the door for future use of nuclear weapons, which is just terrifying. So Ziegler at the press conference said, Congress has to ask itself whether it wants to assume the responsibility of creating doubt in the enemy's mind about the U.S. position, or if Congress wants to raise doubts of what they will do and the effect that that will have on the negotiations in delaying negotiations. And also says the public, now he didn't say this is now the book author, the public relations battle over the bombing also was hitting some very rough spots. Kissinger reported that the Pentagon was asked whether or not the pilots of the B-52s, whose bombs destroyed the Bach Mai Hospital in Hanoi, would be punished. The Pentagon response showed how difficult it was to control messaging, especially in the bedlam of war. The Pentagon spokesman said it was unclear that the pilots would be punished because it was not certain that the hospital had been destroyed by American planes, and Kissinger complained that this was stupid to say on 2 counts. 1, it was clearly done by American planes, and 2, it admits there might be punishment. In discussions between Nixon and Kissinger, he made it absolutely clear that there was no other course but peace. It was all or nothing, and that they pretty much had decided that a bad deal was preferable to continuing the war. Then it pivots to the funeral of Harry Truman. Sayer, not sure how to pronounce it, was a descendant of Woodrow Wilson. He was the one giving the eulogy and the one that Nixon really hated, which is why he didn't go to the funeral. And it's noted that Wilson was, and still is, as of at least the writing of this book, the only president of the United States buried in the National Cathedral, or for that matter, within the boundaries of D.C. I had no idea of that. And the author of the book kind of goes off a bit into just a little bit of eulogizing of Harry Truman himself, where he said, Harry Truman's accomplishments changed the course of humankind. As president, he acted distinctly on the world stage. He brought an end to the Second World War, and in the process, shouldered the burden of making the decision to use atomic weapons. His support was crucial to the birth of the State of Israel. He led America and the United Nations into the Korean conflict, and presided over the start of the harrowing Cold War and the costly plan for the containment of communism. Now, if you remember Reston, who was the columnist for the New York Times that wrote that article that so pissed off Nixon, and Kissinger was finally implicated in being the leak that was the source for that story. That same author had written a column about the funeral of Harry Truman called Harry's Lovely Farewell, which is where the title of this chapter comes from. Now, Nixon was continuing his hate-hate relationship with the press. It said the Washington Star had misquoted him from his breakfast meeting with congressional leaders. Nixon told the leaders that he was neither optimistic nor pessimistic about the upcoming negotiations in Paris to end the war. But the Star headline read that the president was not optimistic about the talks. That's not true, but it's also not true. That is kind of a dirty way to characterize that statement. And Coulson reported to the president that after they started keeping the log on Henry Kissinger's phone calls, they did discover that he was talking with some people from the press. In fact, one of the people he was talking to came out with a column the next day basically kissing Kissinger's ass. That's interesting way to use the words there. And Nixon then directed Coulson to get a log on Kissinger's private phone, not just his White House phone, and emphasized that Kissinger is not to know that this is happening. In this chapter ends with oblivious to the threat to his presidency that the Christmas bombings had sparked. Nixon wrote in his diary over the weekend, Coulson told me that he tried to do everything he could to keep Hunt in line from turning state's evidence. And after what happened to Hunt's wife, etc., I think we have a very good case for showing some clemency. The implications of his involvement in discussions of clemency for a Watergate criminal, one who was about to go on trial, would turn out to be catastrophic. And that is it for Chapter 8. All right, I took a tiny break because now we're going to go into Chapter 10, which I've already done, and Chapter 9. And I just hate having to redo stuff, and I have to do that all the time with my YouTube channel. So the title of this one is I wanted the young prosecutor to know just how whitewashers are engineered. This deals with the interplay between the attorneys and the judge in the upcoming Watergate trial. This judge was just as dirty or corrupt or agendified, whatever you want to say. He was not a good judge, as the defendants were. But of course, he thought he was on the side of the angels, so breaking the rules was fine. This will detail that, but I'm thoroughly disappointed to learn this. And remember, the judge, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I'm going to pronounce it Siraka. And Silbert was the government prosecutor. Bittman was Hunt's attorney. So at least that reminds you of some of the key players here. Talking about Siraka, the author here says, he harbored his own strong suspicions that the truth behind the break-in was more likely to be found in newspaper accounts than in the presentation that the government was intending to make during the trial in his courtroom in January 1973. He had come to his own conclusion that higher-ups had to be involved. He was obsessed with the origin of the money found on the defendants, thinking that this could be the trail leading back to more important people at the CRP, and that's the Committee to Re-elect the President, or even the White House. As a consequence, Judge Siraka injected himself into the case in a way that was very unjudge-like. Rather than presiding as a neutral and impartial arbiter of the dispute, he began to act as another prosecutor, one who by his own lights would not be tainted by association with the President or the Department of Justice. And that is a miscarriage of justice. Sirica later wrote that he knew the prosecutors did not have to prove motive, but that was besides the point. He wanted to know. From the standpoint of the law, it simply didn't matter why the men had broken into the Democratic headquarters. The only issue was whether or not they had committed the crimes. Now it goes back into his background a little bit. He had private practice in small-time criminal courts. He became himself a federal prosecutor. He also started working for the Republican Party. And even after leaving politics, politics remained a hobby. So, in these proceedings, Sirica said to Bittman, "When you have a question of intent and motive involved, which I believe you have in this case, this jury is going to want to know somewhere along the line, what did these men go into the headquarters for? What was their purpose? Was it their sole purpose to go in there for so-called political espionage, or were they paid to go in there? Did they go in there for financial gain? Who hired them to go in there? Who started this thing? There are a myriad of problems in this case that I can see coming up, and so can you. The jury are going to want to know these things." And the book continues, and I'm going to read this in full because I think this is important and shameful. Sirica did little to disguise his bias against the defendants and was even more direct in off-the-record encounters with Silbert. As he retold it in his memoirs, a few days before the trial was to start, he spoke privately with Silbert about an administrative matter in another case. He took the occasion to deliver a pep talk to Silbert about the upcoming Watergate trial. "Earl, look," he said, "you've got a great opportunity in this case if you go right down the middle and let the chips fall where they may. Don't let anyone put pressure on you." To underscore his meaning, Sirica presented Silbert with a bound copy of hearings before a congressional committee in which Sirica had acted as counsel in 1944. The proceeding was an investigation of activities of the Federal Communications Commission, and Sirica came to the conclusion that nothing was going to be done because the fix was in from the Roosevelt administration. Sirica resigned in protest. But his message to Silbert was intended to be, and likely was, plain. "I wanted the young prosecutor to know just how whitewashers were engineered," Sirica wrote. "And I wanted him to know that I had direct experience with cover-ups as chief counsel to that commission." So that's where the title of this chapter came from. This continues. "This highly improper ex parte communication between the judge and a lawyer representing only one of the parties was not only unethical under judicial and legal canons, but also a patent violation of the basic concepts of fairness and due process for the defendants who were facing serious criminal charges. Judge John Sirica didn't seem to think it mattered if his goal was to get to the truth as he saw it, and he sensed a whitewasher was in progress." And it segues into some background history of some of the players in the Watergate crime. One of them was a gentleman named Baldwin, and he was hired at first by Jim McCord to shadow anti-war demonstration groups in D.C. He, in fact, even got gassed once in doing his job. Then the assignment eventually switched, and he was given a hotel room at Howard Johnson's, I believe, across the street from the Watergate building. And McCord explained to him the new assignment, that there was a plan to wiretap the telephone conversations of Larry O'Brien, the chairman of the DNC, from his office in the DNC headquarters at the Watergate across the street. Baldwin did not question the legality of what he was doing. He thought that his CRP superiors, including John Mitchell, the former Attorney General of the United States, must have had good cause and legal justification for what he was being asked to do. He assumed what they were doing was authorized in some fashion. And then there's some talk about the bugs were installed in the wrong office, and one of them wasn't working properly. And they even, I think it was transmitted wirelessly, because they moved Baldwin to a hotel room on a higher floor in order to see if that improved reception, which it did not. So it continues. Because the listening devices McCord had planted at the DNC headquarters had been placed in the wrong office, and because at least one of the bugs appeared not to be working, McCord and Baldwin hatched a plan to have Baldwin go into the DNC office, play some games, and find out where the correct office was. The second break-in was planned for later that weekend after Baldwin accomplished this. In the early hours of Saturday, June 17th, Baldwin was the lookout as McCord and the four Miamians, sometimes referred to as the Cubans in this narrative, entered the DNC headquarters. Hunt and Liddy were in the Watergate Hotel, which is a different building, acting as the command center. Baldwin turned on the late show and kept one eye on the street below. Perhaps an hour later, he noticed a car drive up with plainclothesmen who jumped out and hustled inside the Watergate. He walked out onto his balcony to get a better look. Once the men were in the building, Baldwin could see them searching the upper floors of the Watergate with guns drawn. He tried to radio the burglars and Hunt and Liddy, but it was too late. "They got us," one of the burglars whispered into his walkie-talkie before it went silent. The 5 men caught inside the DNC headquarters were arrested and let out in handcuffs. At almost the same time, Liddy and Hunt emerged from the nearby Watergate Hotel to make their getaway. On Wednesday, June 21st, just 5 days after the Watergate, Baldwin's attorneys called the FBI and basically offered him up as a witness if he wouldn't be charged. And he also was feeding information to the DNC at this point. Now, McCord, out on bail, told Baldwin to lie and testify before the grand jury that he worked for McCord Associates and not the committee to re-elect. But Baldwin ended up turning state's evidence and identified photos of Hunt and Liddy for the FBI. Now, Magruder, with the assistance of Porter, concocted a cover story to explain the money I talked about earlier, where Sirocco was obsessed about the source of this money that Liddy had. It was $250,000, and it was irrefutable that he had this money. So they would claim that the money was for security and other legitimate intelligence gathering purposes. Of this, we said $100,000 was for a surrogate protection program wherein 10 young people would be paid $1,000 a month for 10 months to infiltrate radical groups. But they never could name these 10 people because, of course, it was a lie. And he said, and Magruder said that the reason they couldn't identify the young people is shoddy bookkeeping. Silbert's diary shows that he bought Magruder's storyline hook, line, and sinker. He never even asked for the names of the 10 people. Silbert decided that Magruder was on the up and up and should not be indicted, and actually thought he could be a pretty good witness. The trail thus would run cold, with Hunt, Liddy, and McCord, and no higher-ups were going to be held to an account. And on October 1st, the Los Angeles Times published Baldwin's first-person account of his story. Now, however, Everything changed 4 days after the December 4th pretrial conference when Dorothy Hunt's plane crashed in Chicago. Howard Hunt instructed Bittman to strike a deal with Silver and to nail down a promise of clemency from the White House. They worked out a plea deal, but then Soroka, in which he would plead guilty to 3 of the 6 charges, which included 2 counts of conspiracy to bug and to commit burglary and the burglary itself. Soroka rejected the plea deal and said, if he's going to plead guilty, let him plead guilty to all 6 counts. And then the trial began on January 8th with the start of the jury selection process, which is called voir dire, which is, I think, Latin for speak the truth. Now, turning back to the White House, Nixon discussed clemency for Hunt with Colson. The reason for it is Hunt had a distinguished service in service of his country and his wife's death. Nixon would not be in favor of showing such mercy to the other defendants, including Liddy. And he believed Liddy would hold firm even if he didn't get clemency. And it finishes with Judge John Soroka could not have imagined a better transcript to prove that a whitewasher was underway. Colson himself did not know that he was being recorded. Few did. Just making sure it was recording. If I had to do this a 3rd time, I was going to hang myself. It would not be until the summer of 1973 that the existence of the taping system would become known. And that is it for Chapter 9. We've got 10 and 11 to do.